Hi, everybody. Welcome to our CLE, the Clean Air Act and Moving Environmental Justice Forward. I am Ashley Wilms, Executive Director of Kentucky Resources Council. We are a statewide public interest environmental law and advocacy organization. Since about 1984, we have been a trusted source of legal representation and assistance to individuals, local governments, and grassroots organizations on environmental energy issues impacting our state. We work to protect Kentucky's natural resources, our environment, our communities, and our people through litigation, advocacy, and education. So thank you very much for joining and what I hope will be the first of many free brown bag CLEs on environmental and energy issues. Before introducing our speaker, I wanted to make sure you all saw the invitation to join KRC's referral list. We provide free legal representation to those living downhill, downwind, and downstream of environmental problems who cannot afford representation or find representation. And if you are interested in being on our referral list, please email me or message us in the chat. And so we often seek to refer a case where someone can't find a private attorney, or if the case is someone outside of our scope of work, or where we may have a conflict or capacity issue. Most of the time, this would be paid cases, but please indicate if you are also willing to accept a case pro bono or at a reduced fee. So with that, let me introduce Byron Gary, the Program Attorney for Kentucky Resources Council. Byron studied political science and philosophy as an undergraduate at the University of Louisville and also attended law school at U of L. At Brandeis, he was president of the Environmental Law and Land Use Society and co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Animal and Environmental Law. Byron came to us from the Louisville Metro Air Pollution Control District, where he was in charge of regulation development and the Louisville State Implementation Plan. So with that, I'll let Byron take it over.
Thanks, Ashley. So as Ashley mentioned, the name of our program today is Clean Air Act and Moving Environmental Justice Forward. As an initial matter, I wanted to give a little roadmap of what I'll be talking about. The first part of my presentation is centered around giving a overview of the Clean Air Act for important context. And after I get through the Clean Air Act, generally I'll talk about permitting under the Clean Air Act and then get into the environmental justice part. Talking about the Clean Air Act, just a little bit of history first. The Clean Air Act in its current form really started in 1963, but prior to that, there were a few important events that led up to it. In 1948, a small town in Pennsylvania named Denora outside Pittsburgh was covered in a smog for about 3 days leading up to Halloween that killed at least 50 people, and about half the town was sickened. 1952, London saw an even bigger Great Smog settle in, and that killed somewhere between 4,000 and 12,000 people. And those events really led up to the first Air Pollution Control Act that was adopted in 1955. That Air Pollution Control Act was really about research money and laying the groundwork for the Clean Air Act as we know it today. The cooperative federalism model that was established in 1963 with the first Clean Air Act as we name it today is still the model that is used to this day for how the Clean Air Act operates. It really is a matter of both the states and federal government working together to implement all the pieces of the Clean Air Act. In 1970 and 1977, it was significantly amended to add some of the provisions that we'll be talking about today. The 1990 Clean Air Act really consolidated the provisions that are the current framework for the Clean Air Act. It's very little changed since those 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. The one significant change I should note is in 2022 with the Inflation Reduction Act, additional money was funneled through the Clean Air Act, and it also codified what we call the endangerment finding, which is a topic for a whole other talk. The Clean Air Act has, I like to say, 6.5 titles to it. Titles 1 through 3 have been there since at least 1970, I believe. And then in 1990, when Congress amended the Clean Air Act, they appear to have sort of forgotten there was already a Title IV and adopted another Title IV that's now labeled Title IV-A that deals with acid rain, and importantly added Title V permitting requirements, which we'll get to in a little bit. and protection of stratospheric ozone, or the fixing the ozone hole, which is sort of outside of the scope of today. Most of what we'll be talking about today falls into Title I and, of course, Title V, dealing with permitting. There are important environmental justice considerations in some of those other provisions, though, particularly Title II. EPA definitely takes environmental justice seriously when they look at adopting new standards for on-road and off-road mobile sources. And Title III also has some important provisions about citizen suits and citizen engagement that play a role in the environmental justice movement as well. But moving into Title I, there are 3 parts to Title I. Part A deals with air quality emissions and limitations and standard setting by EPA. Part C deals with permitting of new sources in attainment areas, and Part D deals with requirements for non-attainment areas. And we'll get into what each of those things means a little bit more in just a second. A lot of the first part we're going to be talking about falls into Part A. And Part A sort of has 2 main categories of laws that fall into it. And the first one of those is the standard setting by EPA for the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, or the NAAQS. And this is one of the most frequent abbreviations you will hear in the air world. The NAAQS are incredibly important. They are set for 6 criteria air pollutants, and they are set by EPA for those the criteria air pollutants that are so widespread that they really could be found throughout the country. And EPA is required to set those at the level requisite to protect the public health with an adequate margin of safety. They also come from numerous and diverse mobile and stationary sources. The ambient air quality standards are required to be reviewed every 5 years by EPA, and frequently are updated, generally made more stringent than previous. After EPA promulgates the NAAQS, areas throughout the country are all designated attainment, non-attainment, or unclassifiable, and it's based on ambient monitoring throughout the country. There's a huge network of monitors throughout the country that EPA uses to determine whether areas are in attainment or not. And it's important to keep in mind that these are ambient air quality standards. So these are for sort of the community's air at large. It's not the standard that comes out of a stack of a particular facility or out of the tailpipe of a car. It's the confluence of all of those sources together and the air that we all breathe walking down the street, not right at the fence line necessarily. This is a chart of those 6 criteria air pollutants and the current NAAQS for each of them. It's not super important to memorize each of those numbers or anything like that right now. I just wanted to give you all the overview of what the 6 criteria air pollutants are, and point out that aside from the level set for each of them, there are important differences in how those are measured. So each one is measured on a different averaging time. Ozone, for example, is an 8-hour measurement, whereas particulate matter can be measured either annually or over the course of a single day. And for each of those, depending on the averaging time, there can be multiple levels set as well. So you'll see for PM 2.5 or fine particulate matter, there are actually 2 different NAAQS set, one for an annual average and the other for a 24-hour average. You also notice that the form differs for each of them. It's not just the annual average for a single year or the 24-hour average for a single day. It's generally averaged over a period of a year to 3 years, depending on the pollutant. Looking at Kentucky, this is just a quick map of the non-attainment and maintenance areas. So non-attainment areas are those that have been shown to be exceeding a national ambient air quality standard, whereas a maintenance area is one that previously was exceeding a standard and has come back into compliance, but still has ongoing commitments because of their previous non-attainment. The green areas are areas that are non-attainment or maintenance for a single NAAQS, blue for 2, and yellow for 3 different NAAQS. And just really quickly, I'm going to go over a couple of the different national ambient air quality, or the criteria air pollutants, I should say. There are sort of three that have been significant in Kentucky over the past several years, the first of which is ozone. I mentioned earlier, one of the titles of the Clean Air Act deals specifically with the ozone hole. Ozone as a criteria air pollutant is separate. We like to say ozone is good up high, bad down low. We like the ozone layer, but it should stay way up in the stratosphere. Down at our level, ozone is known as smog. It's basically like a sunburn for your lungs when you breathe it in. It's a strong oxidant and causes a lot of problems. It's the only criteria air pollutant that is not emitted directly as well. Ozone doesn't come directly out of the tailpipe of a car, the stack of a factory. Nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds come out of those endpoints, and they mix together in the air, and sunlight provides the energy to make them react. And when they react, they form ozone. Particulate matter is a unique criteria pollutant in another way. It's the only one for which there are a couple of different subpollutants, you could say. There's coarse particulate matter, that's PM10. It's about the size of a fifth the width of a hair, so already pretty small. But then there's fine particulate matter, which is the even more dangerous stuff, and it's 4 times smaller again than that. So it's very small. Particulate matter is sort of like soot or smoke in the air. It affects every part of the body, and the more it is studied in recent years, the more we find out that it affects parts of the body that we didn't even previously anticipate it entering and affecting. That fine particulate matter is so small, it gets into your bloodstream, it can affect everything from brain health to metabolism, definitely your lungs and your heart. Sulfur dioxide is the last one that we still have trouble with here in Kentucky. SO2 primarily comes from burning of coal. It basically makes it hard to breathe. And the last SO2 non-attainment area in Kentucky is over in Henderson and Webster counties. The way states deal with these NACs after they adopt it is through a process called the State Implementation Plan. Each state is required to have a SIP in place that makes state and local rules federally enforceable to really give them teeth and to back them up. There are 2 general types of SIPs. There are infrastructure SIPs or ISIPs. These are required to be submitted every time a NACS is updated, and they deal with the general management of how an area will attain or continue to attain that NACS, as well as things like interstate transport or the good neighbor rule, which might ring some bells for some folks. Then there are non-attainment SIPs. And these have a number of additional requirements that states and local authorities like Louisville must adopt in order to get back into attainment and to deal with non-attainment. This includes things like more stringent review for new sources, an emissions inventory of all the sources that are contributing to a non-attainment problem, and what we call reasonably available control measures and reasonably available control technology, or RACM. As well as putting that all into a plan that will demonstrate how the area plans to get back into attainment and stay there once they make it, and contingency measures in case they fail to make attainment on time. And all of this has really led to a cleaning up of the air over time. Since 1998, you can see the air quality index here in Louisville, where I am. And this is measured against the most recent standards. So back in 98, 99, 2000, you see a lot of days that were red, and some even in the what we call purple category, or extremely unhealthy category. And down to most recently, you see hardly any red days, no purple days anymore at all, and mostly green, yellow, and some orange days, particularly during the summer months. When I started on Title I, I mentioned there are 2 different categories of things that fall under Title I. The first was those NACs and how we deal with those. The second are a couple of more specific technology-based standards, requirements for large industrial sources in particular. The first of those are the New Source Performance Standards, or NSPSs. These deal with those same criteria air pollutants plus a few others, and they generally apply to larger industrial sectors and require them to meet the best systems of emissions reductions, or BSER. These are set at a level that will try to implement that best system that is found at other sources of similar size and nature. They are set based on the type of facility. So an electric generating unit is going to have a different NSPS from, say, a chemical facility or an oil refinery or something along those lines. And they're based on like I said, that best technology that's found out there. The other type of technology-based standards in Title I of the Clean Air Act are the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, or NESHAPs. And we really are getting into the alphabet soup now, but they are also called the MACT standards, short for Maximum Achievable Control Technology, which is a standard defined in the Clean Air Act as the best performing 12% of facilities in a similar category. So EPA evaluates periodically the standards that are actually met by facilities throughout the country and uses those to determine what that MACT really is. And it's important that these deal with hazardous air pollutants. I sort of skipped over that. We're skipping into another type of pollutants. Generally, this is not the 6 criteria air pollutants. These are things that have more acute impacts, things that, for example, cause cancer and other serious health impacts. And it's a very long list of over 100 different air pollutants that are covered by the NESHAPs. Also within the same section as the NESHAPs, Section 112 of the Clean Air Act, there's a provision that deals with risk management plans, or RMPs. These are plans for another type of pollutant altogether that's maybe not even a pollutant, but something that has the potential to go seriously wrong in a very short span of time. So things that can explode, things that can kill you within a matter of minutes. And those plans are required for certain classes of facilities that contain certain quantities of those, that if they escaped or blew up or something like that, could do serious damage. So I'm going to move into permitting under the Clean Air Act. And there are 2 sort of different types of permits under the Clean Air Act, 2 different permitting programs. There's pre-construction or construction permitting. These are permits required before sources are built or modified in certain ways. And we'll get into operating permits after this in just a minute. Looking at the pre-construction permitting program, also called New Source Review. These are generally implemented directly by state, local, and tribal agencies. In Kentucky, the Division for Air Quality, as well as in Jefferson County, the Louisville Metro Air Pollution Control District implements New Source Review. It requires pre-construction or construction permits. Same thing. They both have to be issued prior to construction of a new or modified facility. And there are several different types of New Source Review. There's non-attainment New Source Review, or NNSR. This is for those areas that are designated non-attainment for one of those criteria air pollutants, and it covers only that pollutant. So if an area is non-attainment for, say, lead, NNSR will apply as to emissions of lead from new or modified facilities within that area. It does not apply to automatically all of the other pollutants. The second type of NSR is prevention of significant deterioration. And as the name sort of hints, this is for areas that are attainment to keep them from backsliding back into or into, for the first time, non-attainment. Then there are what are called, depending on the jurisdiction you're in, either synthetic minor or NSR avoidance permits. These are for facilities that have the possibility of being a large enough source for NNSR or PSD to apply, but they artificially find ways to limit their pollution to under those thresholds, so that they still have to get a permit, but they don't have to go through the full NNSR or PSD process. And then there are minor NSR requirements for all the other facilities that are over some basic lower threshold. So looking at NNSR first, this deals with new major stationary sources or major modifications at existing major stationary sources in non-attainment areas. So a facility has to either already be major and be making a major modification or be a new major stationary source. And those thresholds for what counts as major depends on how serious the non-attainment area is. And it requires facilities to achieve the lowest achievable emissions rate, or LAIR, as well as obtain offsets for any increase in emissions of at least 1-to-1, generally something more than 1-to-1. So they have to find offsets that are reductions at other facilities, closures, things of that nature that offset the emissions from that new source or major modification. For prevention of significant deterioration, this also applies to new major stationary sources or major modifications, but specifically in attainment areas. And rather than LAIR, it requires best achievable control technology, or BACT. And rather than offsets, it requires a demonstration that it will not cause or contribute to a violation of the NAAQS, or increments. Increments are certain quantity of increase in ambient measurements of a particular air pollutant, aimed to keep us from not just going right up to that ceiling of non-attainment, but some level below it. Then there's minor new source review, which is not really clearly laid out in the Clean Air Act in the same way. It only says that state and local agencies are required to have a permitting program. It does not say what the standards are that those state and local agencies have to implement. And even the threshold of emissions that qualify a source for being required to get a permit is not clearly laid out in the Clean Air Act or federal regulations. This is generally something that states take on, particularly to deal with non-attainment or to prevent non-attainment in certain areas, and they have wide discretion in the standards that they set when they're doing that. Then finally, on to Title V of the Clean Air Act. This title is just called permits, but it deals with operating permits, not those construction or pre-construction permits. So it applies also to major sources. It has much clearer thresholds. If a source emits or has the potential to emit greater than 100 tons per year, TPY is tons per year of a criteria air pollutant, or 10 tons per year of one of those hazardous air pollutants that the NESHAPs deal with, or 25 tons per year of all HAPs combined together. Similar to how sources can avoid the new source review, sources can also take limits to avoid applicability of Title V operating permit requirements. These are confusingly, depending on the jurisdiction, also called synthetic minor limits, or conditional major permits, or FESOP or FEDUP, short for federally enforceable state, or in the case of Louisville, district origin operating permits, or just operating permits. And those require specific limits to avoid going over those major source thresholds. And there are at least 3 different categories of things that must go into an operating permit. A Title V operating permit is required by the Clean Air Act to contain all standards applicable to a source. So it contains all those pre-construction requirements from the non-attainment new source review or PSD determination, the BACT and LAIR requirements applicable to a source, or any minor source requirements that may apply to it, or those synthetic minor or PSD avoidance limits and things like that. All of those are required to go in there, as well as all of those technology-based emissions limitations and requirements that apply to a source. So all of those NSPSs and MACT standards also have to go into the Title V permit. And then the permits are also required to contain adequate monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements to determine whether the source is complying with those pre-construction requirements and the technology-based emissions limitations and requirements. And sometimes those can be supplementary to what are in those technology-based standards or the pre-construction requirements. There are a number of opportunities for public involvement, particularly in Title V permits. There's a minimum 30-day comment period. EPA also is required to, they're not required to review. States are required to submit for review by EPA all Title V permits, and EPA has 45 days to review those. EPA is pretty frank with the fact that they have to be selective in which permits they actually do review. Once that public comment period and EPA review is completed, citizens have the opportunity to petition EPA, if they haven't already on their own, to object to a particular permit. and they have 60 days after the end of the EPA review. APCD also has a provision here in Louisville that allows for folks, either permittees or people who believe they are aggrieved in some way by the issuance of a permit, to petition for an administrative hearing within 30 days of issuance of a permit. Title III of the Clean Air Act, as I mentioned earlier, also contains citizen enforcement suit provisions. These allow citizens to seek enforcement of permit terms if they believe that a permitting authority is not themselves enforcing the permit. It requires, before citizens file a suit, that they give 60-day notice of intent of their intent to file such a citizen suit to the permitter, the permittee, and EPA. And that gives those parties the opportunity to remedy any potential violation or take action on their own prior to the citizen being allowed to file suit. Moving on to environmental justice and permitting. Environmental justice deals with what could otherwise be called environmental racism. EPA's definition of environmental justice is up on the screen here. They state that environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So there is a strong emphasis there on that meaningful involvement portion. And EPA has determined time and time again that justice is best achieved when there is an opportunity for everybody affected by actions to participate in the process as those actions are taken. The other part is the fair treatment, of course, and EPA states that fair treatment is achieved when the same degree of protection from environmental health and hazards and equal access to decision-making processes to have a healthy environment in which to live, learn, and work are enjoyed by everybody. Just a little bit of history about the environmental justice movement really can be traced back hundreds of years to indigenous rights and opposition to colonialism, as well as ongoing struggles for civil rights by communities. The term environmental justice and the associated term environmental racism really found their first use in the US in the 1980s. In particular, there were protests in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982 against a polychlorinated biphenyls or methyl ethyl death facility that was going to be put in near a predominantly Black community. And there were strong protests to and opposition to that occurring. And that's where the current movement really has its roots. Since that time, there have been a number of different guidance and developments. The White House has issued a number of executive orders, starting in 1994 with Executive Order 12898. That number is probably familiar to anybody who has spent a significant amount of time reviewing EPA actions in the Federal Register. There's a note at the end of each one about implications for environmental justice and whether a rulemaking by EPA implicates environmental justice concerns. And that's to achieve compliance with that executive order that was issued by the Clinton administration in 1994. In the past few years, we have seen the Biden administration issue a number of additional executive orders dealing with different aspects of racial equity and environmental justice, starting on the first days of the administration in January 2021. They issued two that had to deal with first racial equity generally, and then also dealing with the climate crisis. And there are portions in both of those dealing with environmental justice. And then just this past April, another executive order was issued on revitalizing our nation's commitment to environmental justice for all. And below that, there are a list of environmental justice guidance documents that EPA has issued over the past several decades. It's admittedly an incomplete list, I think. The next couple of slides, I'm going to spend just a little bit of time dealing with that bottom one, or titled Environmental Justice in Air Permitting, Principles for Addressing Environmental Justice Concerns in Air Permitting. In that document, EPA adopted 8 principles for addressing environmental permitting or environmental justice in air permitting. The first is to identify communities that are EJ communities. EPA points to its own tool titled EJ Screen, that is a GIS or mapping tool for identifying environmental justice concerns. And EPA emphasizes looking both at demographic indicators as well as environmental indicators. The second principle is early engagements in the permitting process for people potentially affected by it. And this, EPA says in that document, preferably begins before an application is even submitted, and should involve both the permit applicant as well as the permitting authority, and should look at things such as siting alternatives and mitigation measures as early as possible before a decision is even made that a facility definitely will be built, or that a facility is going to submit an application even. Principle 3 is to enhance public involvement from that point throughout the entire permitting process. It speaks to things from public hearings and public meetings in a more informal setting, and points specifically to ideas such as training on how to make effective comments on permits for the public as one way to enhance public involvement throughout the process. The fourth principle is to conduct an environmental justice analysis. Objectives are to meet those fair treatment and meaningful involvement principles of environmental justice. And such an analysis can include a long list of different things that EPA suggests. A couple of those are things like public health data and the cumulative impact on a particular facility or a particular area or community, not due to just the proposed permit, but as well as other ongoing environmental concerns in a given neighborhood. The fifth principle is to find ways to avoid those impacts in areas where they would be disproportionately burdensome, those EJ communities. I'll get to some of the legal tools that EPA points to as ways to try to avoid and mitigate those concerns in the next slide, but they also point to the possibility of looking to other entities such as state and local government outside of the permitting authority itself, but other ways to find authorities to help mitigate and minimize those disproportionately high effects. It also points to looking as much as possible at less discriminatory alternatives for a proposed permit. Principle 6 really speaks for itself. EPA has committed to providing federal support throughout the air permitting process. They themselves will often volunteer to assist in any way they can. Principle 7 is to enhance transparency throughout. And EPA says, importantly here, not just to put everything out there, permit applications and Title V permits or construction permits can be incredibly dense technical documents that are inscrutable for the layperson potentially affected by them. And EPA emphasizes that this transparency should be in a meaningful way that is understandable and readily accessible by the community. And then Principle 8 is just about building capacity to do all of those first 6 or 7 other things that they encourage permitting authorities, as well as applicable to EPA itself, to do environmental justice permitting decisions. Looking at one of the other documents that was sent along with the materials for this presentation, there are EPA legal tools to advance environmental justice from May 2022. And a selection of that was sent along to folks. Reading through that, EPA points to several provisions of the Clean Air Act that can be used in permitting to help enhance environmental justice. The Prevention of Significant Deterioration portion of the Clean Air Act has provisions allowing for consideration of alternatives and other appropriate considerations. EPA also points to the possibility of requirements for additional monitoring around a proposed facility, both before construction and after, as something that the Clean Air Act allows for, that could help determine what the actual effects of a facility will be and then subsequently are if it is approved. Within the non-attainment new source review statute, there is a provision that requires an analysis of alternative site sizes, production processes, and environmental control techniques. EPA emphasizes this is incredibly broad. They don't have any regulations yet that specifically require an environmental justice analysis as a part of this or any of these other provisions. but EPA emphasizes that each of them is broad enough to potentially encapsulate a requirement for an analysis such as that required by the principles or suggested by the principles that we just talked about. Title V has some of the strongest opportunities for public comment and hearing on permits. In addition, as I mentioned before, one of the important provisions of Title V is a requirement that there be sufficient monitoring, compliance certification, and reporting requirements in a permit to determine whether standards are actually, in fact, being met. And this is one of the areas often where we find permitting authorities have the most discretion in issuing Title V permits. Oftentimes, by the point a facility is to the point of getting a Title V permit, they already know what all of those pre-construction requirements are. Those technology-based standards are already set by EPA in the NSPS and MACT standards. And Title V permit is often just rolling those all up into a permit, and there's not much opportunity. In fact, Title V specifically does not allow for EPA or a permitting authority to put additional emissions limitations in there. But there is an opportunity for additional monitoring, compliance certification, and reporting requirements. Just a really quick look at a few environmental justice initiatives that have been happening in recent years throughout the country. Cancer Alley in Louisiana, St. John the Baptist Parish, and nearby areas in particular have seen a lot of scrutiny from the public and nearby citizens. EPA, in fact, earlier this year found in a letter to Louisiana that there was a possible violation of Title VI of the Clean Air Act by the disparate impact that permitting decisions in that area had on Black and poorer citizens in particular. They later closed that investigation without taking any further action, but that area still remains in the spotlight. Another significant ongoing legal battle is in Chicago, in the south side of Chicago. A metals recycling facility was denied a permit, actually based on the potential for a significant cumulative impact in South Chicago, a historically disadvantaged community. And the applicant for that permit has appealed the decision, and that case is still ongoing. California has seen, unsurprisingly, some of the broadest protections for environmental justice, but also some of the most serious concerns in areas such as around the harbors in Los Angeles, where there are factories next to warehouses, next to shipping hubs, where communities are sited right next to all of these things. And they adopted a law requiring specific analysis for air and other environmental permitting actions. And they have started the Community Air Protection Program. One of the significant provisions here is they have required more air monitoring around some of these affected facilities and environmental justice communities. Similarly, New Jersey has adopted an environmental justice law in recent years that requires a look at cumulative impacts of environmental permitting decisions. And then right here in Louisville, going back before any of those actions that I just mentioned, actually, to 2005, Louisville adopted the Strategic Toxic Air Reduction Program in 2005. The maps above show the starting point for when that program was adopted. On the left, you can see census data on the percent of persons of color by census tract in Louisville, with the highest proportion, of course, in West Louisville. And on the right, you can see the modeled, not monitored, but modeled cancer risk from point sources, so those large factories and facilities within Louisville in 2005, right when the STAR program was adopted. The highest risk was in excess of 200 excess deaths from cancer per million citizens when that was adopted, and it's all disproportionately centered right around that same predominantly minority community. The STAR program, adopted in 2005, it's a incredibly complex regulatory program, especially for a local permitting authority to have taken on. The result primarily of significant citizen push, as well as some local monitoring that took place here in Louisville. And it contains, the way I think about it typically, it contains three different sort of steps. The first, the program requires the setting of benchmark ambient concentrations for certain toxic air contaminants. So determining what the benchmark is to try to reach an ambitious goal of 1 in a million. So that benchmark for a given pollutant is the level in the air that would cause no more than 1 excess cancer death per million. And then taking those benchmark ambient concentrations sets environmental acceptability goals for sources. These are set at a level of 7.5 or 3.8 in a million for all pollutants from a given source, and 1 in a million for a given pollutant from a given point at a particular source. So these environmental acceptability goals were incredibly ambitious. I should also note they go above and beyond when EPA is evaluating those NESHAPs, the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants, that cover a lot of the same pollutants covered by the STAR program. Their goal is to provide for standards that will lead to no greater than 100 in a million cancer risk as the benchmark that they are aiming for. So the STAR program, last after setting these BACS and EA goals, required every significant source of toxic air contaminants in Louisville to either go through screening, showing that their emissions were small enough that they couldn't possibly exceed these standards, or go through complex air dispersion modeling to show whether and where they might potentially exceed these goals, and then to find ways to get back below those limits. And the impact has been significant. The map on the left is the same as the first one, except it's updated to 2019 census data from the American Community Survey. It shows persons of color. Not much has changed demographically in Louisville. And the map on the right is actually first a bit of a story of how to be careful with your data. When you see something that doesn't look right, it probably isn't. It shows just that single census tract in bright yellow there at just over 40 in a million from as the cancer risk from point sources. This came out back when I was working at the Air Pollution Control District, actually, and we took a closer look at this because it didn't quite look right to us. And we determined that the majority, not all, but the majority of the risk in that one census tract showing in excess of 40 in a million was a source that was small enough that I don't think they were actually even reporting emissions to us on an annual basis, but they were required to report to the toxics release inventory that EPA maintains because of an entirely different environmental program. Importantly, the TRI doesn't set limits or have any enforcement mechanism for excess emissions. It only requires reporting. And this facility was just, instead of doing the math required to calculate how much they were emitting, reporting incredibly high numbers. I think for some pollutants, they were just reporting how much of a given material they used rather than how much was actually making it out the stack. Hopefully that facility was not just dumping all of its product directly out of stack. Anyway, if you look again at the map, just taking that single census tract out, here's the risk from all point sources in Louisville today. The highest is between 8 and 10 in a million in a tract sort of still nearby that other one. But the point is here, there has been a dramatic reduction, but even despite that, you can still see there is a disparate impact in West Louisville and around predominantly neighborhoods predominantly of persons of color. So there is still an impact, and there's still certainly work to be done. With that, there's another slide here just with a few other resources and links. I think we'll be able to distribute these slides after, along with that CLE information. So feel free to click through some of these and learn more. I think with that, I'll wrap it up. I'm going to stop sharing and see all of y'all and see if anybody has any questions. Are we thinking of a facility that has caused environmental justice concerns and a way that maybe has been remedied? In that case, I would point back to the STAR program, and I'd actually compare what happened here in Louisville with the STAR program to what's going on in Cancer Alley. And there's a particular parallel there, because in 2005, when Louisville adopted the STAR program, there was a facility in West Louisville that produced chloroprene or produced neoprene. Neoprene rubber was their product, but one of the main precursors to creating neoprene is chloroprene, which is an incredibly cancer-causing pollutant. It contributed a whole lot of that cancer risk that I showed there in the first slide about 2005. There was only one other facility at the time producing neoprene in the US, and it was actually in St. John the Baptist Parish in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. Unsurprisingly, they were both owned by the same facility, the same parent company. And after the STAR program was adopted, they made a decision to consolidate production in Louisiana. So emissions of chloroprene across Louisville dropped drastically. That was one of the big success stories of the STAR program early on. And the facility in Louisiana is still to this day causing modeled cancer risks in excess of 100 in a million. And it's one of the main drivers in that particular part of Cancer Alley to risks that are ongoing. And it was one of the facilities actually that was the subject to that Title VI finding by EPA earlier this year. Aside from that, I should emphasize, I really focused in on environmental justice and permitting here. That's sort of the piece that, as local activists and organizations, we have the opportunity potentially to comment on most directly. Those MACT standards set by EPA and the NSPSs are not something that we, as local organizations, have the opportunity or the capacity really to comment on as often. But EPA is definitely, when it goes through those rulemaking procedures, taking environmental justice seriously. Not a specific case study, but one other specific example. EPA just recently closed a comment period on updating one of those niche apps. AIR is one of the only worlds where you will find an acronym within an acronym, but it was the Hazardous Organic Niche App, or HON. And it dealt with organics such as chloroprene coming from large chemical facilities. And one of the things that they proposed to do was, based on some of these environmental justice things that we've seen happening around the country, was to add a requirement that those facilities install monitors right on their fence lines. Oftentimes, environmental justice communities will see large clusters of facilities, to the point where somebody smells something in Rubbertown here in Louisville. It's difficult, if not impossible, to trace the source of that back to a given particular facility, just based on the fact that, you know, there may be one, maybe two monitors in a given environmental justice community. So determining what that chemical even is, let alone which facility it's coming from, can be difficult. So EPA first required fence line monitoring a few years ago for oil refineries, and have seen that it's a great success in areas like the Houston shipping channel. And now they have proposed to expand that to other chemical facilities. And it would be a wonderful opportunity just to learn more about what's coming across the fence line and where it's coming from across the country. Can you talk about how the APCD DAQ deal with odor issues and the EJ implications of noxious odors? APCD and DAQ have two different odor regulations. In Louisville, the odor regulation is incredibly broad. It requires basically that odors not impact persons or communities at all. APCD, up until recently, due to a number of retirements, actually, and resignations, had a whole compliance enforcement staff whose main jobs were mostly to go and investigate odor complaints and open burning complaints. So people with backyard fire pits that were not in compliance with the rules. Every time an odor complaint was received, a compliance officer would go out to a community and see if they could detect the same odor, and whether they could trace it to a specific source. In some areas, this was incredibly easy. Butchertown in Louisville has one butcher anymore, and it's a giant facility. So if you smell rendering, it's probably coming from that facility. And it's not surrounded by other facilities. You can literally just drive a loop around it, and if you smell it coming from one side, not the other, then you know where it's coming from. This is a lot more difficult in Rubbertown. They are working on enhancing odor reporting with a new tool they are debuting from EPA that allows folks to more specifically name what type of odor they are smelling. But one of the faults that we hear from the community a lot is that the compliance investigations aren't happening in real time. So a community member may smell something overnight and nobody gets out there to investigate until the next day. This, of course, means the odor is gone. I think technology hopefully will be a large aid here, particularly if that HAN rule that I mentioned is adopted as proposed. This would allow investigations based on real-time. Now maybe the HAN doesn't require real-time; it's more averaged reporting, but it would at least allow fence line monitors to detect when there are large emissions. DAQ, on the other hand, has a more prescriptive rule around odors that requires the use of a tool where investigators will actually go out to investigate these odor complaints and put this tool to their nose that dilutes the ambient air. I think it's to a level of 7 in 1. And if they can still detect the odor, even after it's been diluted 7 times over, then it's automatically a violation. I think this comes into play more around large waste and dump facilities in the rest of the state, as far as what I've heard, than it does around chemical facilities. I'm not as familiar with how they deal with the implications of noxious odors. But that is definitely a large EJ concern, particularly here in Louisville. See, we're over time, but I'm happy to stick around and take any other questions if anybody has any. Otherwise, just say thank you so much to everybody for coming today. Wonderful to see so many folks able to join, and look forward to being able to speak to you guys soon, or even better to hear one of my colleagues speak about something that they know more about than I do.